More Tales Told by a Dubliner by Turlough Conmee. Story number 10. The Dragon's Teeth. My sister married into the Kavanaghs, a farming family from County Kilkenny. Pat Kavanagh, my brother-in-law, was the only one who moved away to work in Dublin. The rest stayed down on the farm and worked with their father, Mossy Kavanagh. I remember there were three of them: Frank, Séamus and Ronan. I got to know the family a bit through knowing Pat, who lived in Dublin with my sister Linda. I used to hear from her about doings in the family and how they all used to get together at the old Kavanagh farmhouse for Christmas, Stephen's Day or the New Year. They might meet at Easter and other special times as well. They really did their best to keep together as a family. The brothers, their wives and children would be gathered around the table together at these occasions, and it was good to see, Linda told me, how harmonious things were and how well they got along. Now Mossy, the father, was a widower, and he was happy to preside over the whole assembly of them. But then, of course, Mossy upped and died. Now, by this stage of the game, the two elder brothers were in their 40s. Frank had studied agriculture in Cork, and he had gone on to become a lecturer in agricultural science at the local college in Kilkenny. Séamus had become a chef and was in charge of the canteen at Kilkenny Hospital. Pat was also out of the farming game. He was up in Dublin working for RTE. Ronan, on the other hand, had done a degree in agriculture like his brother Frank in Cork, but he was committed to a life of farming. When they discussed amongst themselves what to do with the family farm, there was no contest really. Frank and Séamus had made careers for themselves away in the county town, and Pat was living in Dublin. So none of them wanted to take over the farm, which was a good big landholding with crops, livestock and poultry. Ronan, on the other hand, was keen to farm, so they came to a decision that he would take over the farm and own the major part of it. And so Ronan was the farmer now, and sometimes he hosted the family get-togethers, and sometimes it was Frank or Séamus. This went on in great peace and harmony for a while, but then something happened. Linda told me there were dark rumours of strife among the brothers, and that the get-togethers were without Ronan now. She talked about this one night when I was over at their house on a visit, so Pat felt compelled to say something of what he knew. "It's about pigs," he told us. "Ronan wants to be a pig farmer, and he wants to turn the farm into a major pork-producing and pig-breeding facility. The others don't like it. They don't like his approach. But he's the farmer now. The ball is at his feet, you might say, and he can do pretty much as he sees fit. But they don't like it." My sister went on to say that there was now a feud among the Kavanagh brothers. She and Pat had been down in Kilkenny at Christmas, and Ronan wasn't around. Nobody even talked about him. They thought of going over to the farm to see Ronan on Stephen's Day just for a visit, but in the end they didn't do it, and just drove back to Dublin. When I was talking to Pat later that spring, he looked worried. Linda said he'd talked to Ronan on the phone, and now Pat seemed to want to tell me about it. "I don't know what to make of it," he said. "He's concentrating on the pigs all right, even though Frank and Séamus were all against it." "By all accounts," says I, "pig farming is not popular with people who have to live anywhere near it. You get the smell of them for miles around when there's a lot of them, isn't that it?" "It's more than that," said Pat, shaking his head. It seems he's carrying out experiments. It's experimental farming, something to do with producing new breeds. He talked about sowing the dragon's teeth. Does that mean anything to you? Not really, says I. I'd have to look it up. He's got this expression about sowing the dragon's teeth from a couple of fellas he's working with now. On the farm? Who are they? I asked. Yanks, he said. Yanks? Aye, Yanks. They're two fellas over from Miskatonic University, somewhere in the States. Never heard of it, says I. Well, it seems he has them over at the farm, advising him how to set up what they call an experimental pig breeding facility. Well, that's a queer one, says I. And I suppose all that doesn't go down too well with the brothers. No, said Pat, shaking his head helplessly now. Listen, he said suddenly. I want to drive down and see how things are for myself. I want to talk to Ronan too. Maybe I can talk some sense into him. He'll talk to me. He knows I'm neutral. But will you come with me? I'd value your opinion, and you would know better how to talk to them boyos from the States. Sure, you were years over there yourself. We'll both talk to them. We'll have to. Otherwise we won't know the half of what's going on. Will you come? I nodded. What else could I do but go with them as a neutral party and see what we could do to patch up the feud among the Kavanaghs? We drove down to Kilkenny on a soft morning in April. On the way down, I told Pat about what I'd found in books about this business of sowing the dragon's teeth. It was part of Greek mythology, and there were two stories about it. The first was about Cadmus, the inventor of the alphabet and the founder of Thebes. His companions were all killed by a dragon, but with the help of the gods he was able to slay it. Then he was told to plough a field and sow the dragon's teeth in it. After a time, armed men sprang up out of the furrows, and they seemed fierce and ready to attack him in a body. But Cadmus picked up stones and threw them at these sown men. When he did, they weren't intelligent enough or human enough to understand what was happening. They blamed the warriors near them for hitting them, and so they turned on one another. There was a melee on the ploughed field, and they all slew one another except for a few exhausted ones left standing at the end. Trusting they would become human, Cadmus enrolled them as the first citizens of the new city he founded on the spot. The other story was about Jason when he went to find the golden fleece. The king of the country wouldn't let him have it unless he ploughed a field and sowed the dragon's teeth. This king obviously had picked up a few that Cadmus had left over. Again the armed warriors sprang up. They made to attack Jason, but he threw stones at them and they turned on one another till not one of them was left standing. I see, said Pat at the end. But what does all this mean to Ronan and the two Yanks? I can't make head nor tail of it, I admitted. It all depends on what the dragon's teeth are, or who the dragon is, doesn't it? It doesn't even make sense as it stands. I mean the story, said Pat. Sure, you can't sow teeth and expect a crop will grow. To sow, you need seed. Aye, I said, but I dare say Cadmus had the devil's own job, pulling out the teeth from the dragon's mouth, and it did. They must have been big if it was a dragon. Wouldn't he have needed to smash the teeth into small pieces with a hammer? Then there would be so many small white bits, fragments, like seed from a seed bag. They would be the seeds. But we'll have to hear more about this when we talk to Ronan. When we drove up the grassy lane to the Kavanagh farm, there was Ronan on the other side of the 5-barred gate, waiting to let us in. We parked in the farmyard in front of the old house. Come on in and we'll sit down at the table, he told us. The other lads will be in for lunch later on. Ronan was a man of about 30, and though he had come into an entire family farm, he hadn't married yet. I suppose his mind was too much on other things for the moment, especially the art and science of pig farming. Still, he had done himself proud in the farmhouse kitchen and had cooked a fine Irish stew for us. There's plenty of it, he said, and it's all my own produce, pork, potatoes and vegetables of all sorts. While we waited for the others to come in from their morning's work, we sat around the table and Ronan filled us in on what he was actually doing. The pigs are for pork and bacon in the first instance, he explained, and that's why we always raise pigs. But now there's another reason. Medical research. It turns out that pigs' internal organs are like enough to ours that they could be used for transplants. So people that needed a kidney wouldn't have to wait for someone to die before they could get one, which is what happens now. So you want to provide organs from your herd of pigs for that? I asked, the whole thing starting to dawn on me now. That's it, he said. But first the pigs have to be bred in a certain way so that their organs are really suitable for human use. And how will you do that? Asked Pat. Well, that's where the two lads come in. You'll meet them in a minute. They got in touch with the agricultural faculty in Cork, asking to partner with farmers over here to raise these special pigs. If they could get it right, there would be a market in hospitals all over Europe. Now, a lot of farmers wouldn't touch this kind of thing. They say it's unnatural. But I heard about this from people I know in the ag faculty in Cork, and so I offered to work with them to see if we could breed the right pigs. I entered into a contract with them, and two of them are over here to work on site. It's interesting work, for me too. So this is what you call sowing the dragon's teeth? I asked. Ronan grinned. Well, that's what one of the Yanks has been calling it, and I picked it up from him. He'd better explain it to you himself. And this work you're doing now, that's what Frank and Séamus object to so much, said Pat. Aye, said Ronan, shrugging his shoulders with irritation. They think the whole thing is unnatural. Tinkering around with God's creation, they call it. Not the kind of thing an honest farmer should be doing, is what they say. They tried to talk me out of it, of course. But then, when I told them I'd signed the contract, they got into high dudgeon altogether and wouldn't have anything to do with me after that. It's just because I'm in possession of the farm and there's not much they can do. They can't dictate to me. Isn't there any way we could patch things up? Asked Pat. Ronan shook his head. No, they've got their minds made up, and I'm not going to run after them trying to change their minds. It's just too bad, but I have other things to do. This project has great potential for widening the whole scope of livestock farming. It'll probably make me a rich man if I play my cards right. Then Frank and Séamus will start to whistle a different tune. You can bet on that. At this point, the two scientists came in, divesting themselves of white lab coats, which they folded and laid carefully over the backs of their chairs. Ronan introduced us. The two men were from the Faculty of Agriculture at Miskatonic University. One was Dr. Alan Halsey, the dean of the faculty, a tall, broad-shouldered, middle-aged man with a moustache, who had a kindly manner that endeared him right away. The other was Dr. Herbert West, a slight, pale young man with a shock of blonde hair that seemed to add to his youthfulness, though he gave the impression of being brilliant and intense. The two sat down, and over lunch, which consisted of Ronan's excellent Irish stew, accompanied by cans of American beer, we began to talk. It seems you have a pretty ambitious project on the go here with my brother, said Pat to the Yanks. We're very glad of the opportunity to work with an energetic young farmer like Ronan, said Halsey in his affable manner. He's really the key man in this whole operation. Ronan has told us a bit about the project already, says I. He calls it sowing the dragon's teeth. They smiled. He said you'd be able to explain what that means better than anybody else. Now it was West's turn to speak. Sowing the dragon's teeth is a metaphor from ancient times, he said in an odd-sounding voice. It expresses the dream man has always had of being able to create new beings like himself, or using the material of existing life to revive and renew human beings themselves. Transplant medicine has shown it can prolong man's life with a new heart, a new liver, kidney, lung, or whatever it may be. Up till now, these had to be harvested from other humans. But now we can harvest them from other species too. Pigs are very suitable. But there's always the risk of the human immune system rejecting these grafts. We need to make them more human somehow. But in the meantime, great strides in genetics have led to genetic technology. We can graft human genetic material into the animal system before we harvest the organs. So that's what you mean by sowing the dragon's teeth, I said. Precisely, said West, and his eyes glittered behind his spectacles. We extract material from one life form, then we sow it in the soil of another, as it were. The result can be used to heal and strengthen the original life form, if need be. So how will you do this with pigs? I asked. Herbert West sat back for a moment. Then he said, We have human genetic material isolated. It's from our laboratory. We inject it into breeding sows and their embryos, so that we create a new line of pigs with some of man's genetic makeup built into them. Then, Halsey went on, it's up to the pig farmer, like Ronan here, to breed this new pig breed in sufficient numbers. Those animals will be worth their weight in gold, you might say. Instead of being shipped to the slaughterhouse, they'll be shipped to a medical facility where their organs will be harvested and supplied to hospitals for use in transplant medicine. After lunch, we went across the farmyard and saw the pig barns. In one of them, the two Yanks had set up their laboratory, and they had a few pens there with pigs in them. These were obviously the experimental population. Leaving the two white-coated researchers to their work, we walked back to the car with Ronan. That's quite an operation, I said. It seems to have its own momentum now. Aye, said Ronan. They should be breeding their first experimental litters in a couple of weeks. And they believe they can do all this here on their own, with pigs supplied by yourself. Aye, said Ronan. They don't want too many people involved, or too much publicity. There are competing research teams in other countries too. The question is who gets there first, and how. But they're very knowledgeable fellows. Halsey there is the dean of his faculty, a very experienced man in the science of livestock breeding. And the other fellow, West, well, he's not an agriculturist at all. His card says he's an MD. So he's the missing link, if you like, to transplants in hospitals and all that. All was quiet for a few months and seemed to be going well. Then Pat got a phone call from Ronan, a disturbing phone call. He wanted to meet somewhere away from the farm. Pat asked did he want to meet at a pub in Kilkenny. No, said Ronan, he wanted to make sure they could talk away from prying eyes and ears. Too many people knew him in Kilkenny, he said. Finally, they agreed to meet at Shaw's Hill, a remote area state forest that was just a few miles from the Kavanagh farm, and Pat asked Ronan if I could come along with him. So the next day, Pat and myself drove down to Kilkenny and turned off into the state forest at Shaw's Hill. Pat knew the place well. He said the Kavanaghs often came here on walks when they were young lads. We parked in the clearing provided just outside the forest. We didn't have long to wait, for Ronan came driving up in his old station wagon about 5 minutes after. We walked together into the forest. There wasn't a soul about, and as we walked, we waited for Ronan to speak. Finally, he stopped and sat on a tree trunk. "Halsey's dead," he blurted out suddenly. "Halsey?" I asked him. "The Dean of Agriculture?" Ronan nodded. "How did it happen?" I asked. "The pigs got out of hand, the young ones, the ones that had human genetic material in them. They just got aggressive. I've never known pigs to be like that way before. Anyway, Halsey was walking across the farmyard to their laboratory when a whole crowd of the pigs just rushed him. They knocked him down and started trampling on him. I came out of the farmhouse just then, and Herbert West came out of the lab, both to see what was the commotion. And commotion there was, because the pigs were all grunting, savagely, and poor Halsey was shouting for help as he tried to fight them off. Then he seemed to collapse. I picked up a couple of stones from the ground and threw them at the pigs, trying not to hit poor Halsey. West aimed a few kicks at them, and I did too, and that was enough to scatter them. We picked Halsey up and carried him into the lab in the barn. "Put him on the table there," said West out of breath, "and I'll see what's wrong with him." He got a stethoscope and listened to Halsey's chest. He looked closely into his eyes. Then he turned to me. "Looks like he's had a massive heart attack," he said. "I'd better call the ambulance," I said. "No," says West, "it wouldn't do. He'd be a goner before they arrived." "Can you do something?" I asked. "First, massage," he said, and started to press down on Halsey's chest. He did that several times, taking a rest after each attempt. Finally, we heard Halsey groan. "We're holding him," said West triumphantly. "Only just." He turned away from the table and mopped his brow. He looked at me then with that strange glittering look in his eyes. "He needs a transplant," he said. "That's the only thing that can save him." "A heart transplant?" I said. "Good God, we'll have to get him to a hospital, so." West shook his head. "There's no time," he said curtly. "I'll have to do it here." "Surgery?" I said aghast. "Surely you can't—" "Yes, I can," hissed West, looking at me in the eyes. "I've got a whole operating theatre here, as good as we'll get. All the instruments we use to dissect the pigs and apply the grafts. It will work. Anesthesia too, we've got that. You will have to be my assistant." "Can you do it?" I said. "A heart transplant?" "Of course. I've worked on transplants before. I can do it." The whole thing seemed like madness to me, but he was the doctor, and I had to believe he knew what he was doing. "All right," West was saying now. "Bring over the surgery kits from those cupboards over there. I'll give him an anaesthetic. But first, I've got to change into scrubs. And you go and find a surgical coat over in the wardrobe. And before you do, wash your hands up to the elbows with antiseptic." While I was doing this, he found some green surgical uniform, put on a mask and a surgical cap to cover his hair. All you could see of him now was the cold, glittering eyes of him behind his glasses. He told me to bring the surgical instruments, and I did. He had undressed Halsey, and he was lying helpless on the operating table. Suddenly it occurred to me to ask, "If this is a transplant, what are you going to use for a new heart?" West looked at me, and his eyes were glinting madly now. I wish I hadn't seen what was in those eyes. It was a look of triumph. I just slaughtered one of those new pigs last night to study its growth. I harvested all its organs." He went to a collection of glass jars on a counter. "Look," he said, holding up a horrible bloody thing in a jar. "We'll give him this, the pig's heart." "No," I gasped. "Yes," he shouted in wild triumph now. "This is what we have been preparing for. This is what we have made possible. This is the future of reanimation medicine. This complete accident has now put the opportunity within our grasp, the opportunity to demonstrate it on a human patient." Then he administered the anaesthetic. As it took effect, West busied himself with preparations for surgery. On a side table, he arranged the instruments he would need. The pig's heart was emptied into a stainless steel basin. Another basin stood ready to receive poor Halsey's heart. West put on his green surgical gloves. He gazed intently at the inert Halsey. "It's now or never," he said. "I wouldn't want to describe what happened next," said Ronan, "but I suppose you can guess. West cut Halsey's chest open, removed his heart, and put it in the empty basin beside him. Then he took the pig's heart and fitted it into the chest cavity. He worked away at splicing the tissues and the arteries, I suppose, and at last, when he was finished, he sewed poor Halsey's chest up again. That anaesthetic will keep him under until tomorrow, he told me. Now we'll change out his scrubs and go into the house and see if we can get a night's rest. I'll get up a few times and come across and see how he is." I staggered off to bed, and West followed. It was hard to sleep after all I had witnessed. I woke up a few times and heard the clump of West's footsteps as he went out to check on his patient, and came back a few minutes later. So passed the night. The next day, West told me that Halsey was still under the anaesthetic and would not awake until the evening. Then he would examine him and see where we were at. He made it sound more like the outcome of an experiment than anything else. That evening we were peering into Halsey's face when he suddenly groaned and shuddered. "He's coming round," said West quietly. Sure enough, Halsey was now tossing and turning on the table where he lay, and soon he opened his eyes. He stared at us from one to the other in puzzlement. "Dr. Halsey," said West to his patient, "I have brought you back from the shadow of death." "And how did I do it?" He chuckled. "I sowed the dragon's teeth. I sowed them in you. You now have a pig's heart." He was leaning over Halsey now, looking into his eyes. Halsey stared back at him. His eyes seemed to bulge. With a great effort he raised himself from where he was lying and tried to hit West with his fists, uttering a roar like a wounded animal. "Get away from me, you little monster!" he shouted. West sprang back, and Halsey, after a moment's bewildered silence, fell back upon the table he had been lying on. "Damn it," said West. "He's having another heart attack." He bent over Halsey's twitching body. "Hold on!" he shouted at the patient. "Dr. Halsey, hold on! I need you to stay with me now. I need you to come through." He started to do a vigorous massage with a pumping motion on Halsey's chest. I couldn't watch. I just stood aside. The massage went on and on. At one point West shouted, "Come on, you bastard! Come around!" But he wasn't having much success. Finally he had to give up. He stood exhausted by the operating table. "We've lost him," West said tonelessly. "I couldn't bring him back. He had another heart attack, with the pig's heart this time, and that finished him off. There's no more we can do for him now. Here, let's get his body into the deep freeze while we still can." He went and opened the large freezer at the back of the lab, while I wrapped poor Halsey in a surgical sheet, and we carried him over then and lowered him into the empty freezer, like as if we were laying him in his coffin. Afterwards I said to West, "We'll have to make arrangements for a burial, I suppose." West shook his head. "We won't tell anyone for now. It could mean the end of our work, which is at a critical stage. It would just mean a lot of questions and recriminations. I know what that's like in the States, and it wouldn't be any different here. No, Alan Halsey is, and must remain, part of our experimental work." "No," I gasped. "Yes," he shouted in reply. "The object of medical science is man. The scientist himself is a man, so it may be that he himself must submit to becoming the object of science." "Why do you want to keep him like this?" I asked. "Halsey and I worked together to produce a line of animals with human DNA in them. Somehow, it didn't work. You saw how it just turned the pigs mean and aggressive. There wasn't enough human DNA in them. And the heart, the pig's heart I gave Halsey, it was from that line. But his immune system rejected that heart, didn't it? It wasn't human enough." His eyes glittered behind his glasses. "Don't you see," he said to me, "we need more human genetic material in those pigs. Otherwise we'll never have organs we can harvest to transplant to humans. I need Halsey to do that." "But he's dead," I exclaimed. "You fool," he shouted and shook me. "Don't you see? I'll use Halsey's DNA. I'll use the genetic material in his body. They'll be Halsey's pigs. He will be famed as a martyr of science." "No," I cried. "Yes," he said again, more calmly now. "I tell you, this research project is going to blow the lid off medical science and surgery as we know them. We'll make a 10-year leap, thanks to Halsey. Think of all the people who will have a new lease on life. I'll probably win the Nobel Prize, and you'll be a rich man, Ronan, beyond your wildest dreams." He grasped me in his arms now. "We must carry on," he said. "There's too much at stake. Leave it with me, and I promise you we'll have a new line of animals that we can both be proud of." Then something seemed to cross his mind. "I don't care if they're mean," he said. "It's a risk that we take. We'll just have to keep them restrained." That was 3 days ago. I haven't gone back to the lab since. But I suppose Herbert West has been extracting Halsey's DNA and transferring it to the breeding sows. God, he may be feeding bits of Halsey to them, but I don't want to know." Ronan stopped. It was quiet in the forest, except for a soft moan of wind in the treetops. Pat and myself looked at him grimly. "What am I to do?" he asked. "There's only one thing you can do," said Pat. "You've got to tell this Yank to shut down his operations and clear out. And then you've got to get that other poor man buried. Or maybe his family will want him shipped back to the States." Ronan hung his head in silence. Then he raised it and said, "But he's so close. West said he's so close to producing the perfect breed of animal." "That's as may be," I said to him. "But you know Pat's right." Ronan nodded. "I'll go back now and talk to him and have the whole thing out with him. As it is, he doesn't know I slipped away to talk to you. He doesn't want anyone to know. But I'll talk to him." "Do you want any help with this?" asked Pat. Ronan shook his head. "Do you want me to tell Frank and Séamus anything?" Ronan shook his head again. "No," he said sulkily. "It would only make things worse." A few months went by, and we heard no more from Ronan. We assumed he was quietly disposing of the experimental operation. Then one morning over breakfast, I heard a news item on the radio that made me blood run cold. "This is RTE Radio News. This morning, Gardaí were called to a farm outside Kilkenny where a herd of animals were reported to be out of control and on the rampage. The owner of the farm, Mr. Ronan Kavanagh, could not be found, and Gardaí are appealing for him to come forward. In the meantime, a team of experts from the Department of Agriculture are on their way to the location. A few minutes later, the phone rang. It was Pat. "Have you heard the news on the radio?" "I have." "We'd better go down right away. Are you free? I'll call over for you in half an hour, okay?" We drove down to Kilkenny at high speed. When we got to the 5-barred gate at the Kavanagh farm, we saw blue uniforms and hazmat suits milling around in the farmyard. We told a guard on duty who we were, and he told us to go in, that someone would be over to ask us a few questions in due course. There was great activity altogether in the farmyard when we went in. They were going in and out of the house, the barns and the laboratory. No one paid any attention to us, so we waited. After half an hour or so, a Garda sergeant from Kilkenny town came to talk to us. "There was some kind of experimental breeding of pigs going on here, was that it?" We nodded. "Aye, the fellows from the Department of Agriculture know something about that. They're scouring the farm trying to pen in those pigs running wild. Now, there were supposed to be 2 Americans working here, but there's no sign of them at all. 'Tis a queer one. And what about your brother Ronan? Have you any idea where he might be? His car's gone, I see." We told him we had only come because we heard about it on the radio. Pat said that Ronan hadn't been in touch with him lately, and he didn't know where he was gone. A few weeks ago, he told us one of the Americans was dead. The Garda sergeant scratched his head. "Glory be," says he, and he made a few notes in a notebook he had with him. At this point, another guard came running up to him. "Sergeant, they've located the animals at several places around the farm. It seems they're awful aggressive and they can't pen them in. They're going to shoot them." Sure enough, the men in the hazmat suits were gathered in a van marked Department of Agriculture, and they were passing them out shotguns from the back of the van. Thus armed, the men tramped out into the fields. The guards left us for now, but soon we saw a car arriving at the gate with Frank and Séamus in it. They strode over to where we were, looking grim. "This is a bad day's work, Pat Kavanagh," said Frank. "Do you have any notion where Ronan is?" asked Séamus. Pat shook his head. "I wish I did. It's not like Ronan to take off like that." Now we began to hear gunshots from out in the pasture. There was an endless series of volleys. "God, what's that?" said Séamus. "They're shooting the pigs," I told him. "It seems they couldn't round them up or get control of them." "Dear God," said Frank. The Garda sergeant was coming back. He came up to us and asked who the new arrivals were. "All brothers," he said. "Listen, one of you should give us a DNA sample. The forensic pathologist is on her way here." "Look," he said, "we found human remains. It might be your brother. Out in the pasture it was. Now, let me tell you right away how it is. There's no way you could identify him, because there's not much of the body left. The pigs must have got him. God save us, but they ate him alive. Or probably trampled him to death, and then ate him." "Dear God," said Frank again. "What makes you think it's Ronan?" "Well, I'm just saying it might be. The DNA will tell. That's why I'm asking for one of you to give a sample." The shooting had died down now. More official cars were coming up to the gate. The men in the hazmat suits were trudging back into the yard and depositing their shotguns in the back of the van. All that was left of Ronan was identified from a DNA match with Frank. By all accounts, there wasn't much of him left. When they searched the lab and the barns later, The guards found the body of a man in one of the deep freezes. It was Halsey. They said the body had been mutilated, but was recognisable. The other piece of the puzzle fell into place when, 2 days later, Ronan's car was found abandoned in the public car park at Shannon Airport. It seems Herbert West had driven it there, then gone into the airport. The Americans have a pre-boarding immigration clearance facility there now. He went there, showed his passport, and was waved through. He quickly boarded a flight for New York that was just leaving. He obviously feared arrest in Ireland, so he left the country. Nothing has been heard from him since. You have been listening to The Dragon's Teeth from More Tales Told by a Dubliner by Turlough Conmee. If you enjoyed this story, feel free to like, subscribe and share, and leave a comment if you like. So, until next time.